The Divergent saga is set in a dystopian future in the city of Chicago, USA, isolated from the rest of the world and under complete control. But how did this civilization come to be? What's the story behind it? In this video, I'll tell you everything about the origin of the Divergent universe and its factions. In a world of thriving cities, advanced technology, and a society that seemed to be at its peak on the surface, a deep crisis emerged. Wars never ceased. Nations fought over resources, and ideological differences divided people. Across the world, the same problems persisted: selfishness, violence, deceit, and fear. One day, a group of renowned scientists, convinced that human flaws were the root of all problems, came up with a radical solution. What if we could change people from their very core, from their DNA? Their idea was simple: get rid of the negative traits that had driven humanity to disaster. No more selfishness, no more aggression, no more lies, cowardice, or ignorance. Only virtues. With the support of political and financial leaders, they began developing a genetic manipulation program. Science had advanced so much that they could edit human DNA before birth, ensuring that babies would be born without the flaws that, according to them, had caused centuries of conflict. A world where no one would lie, no one would be cowardly, and no one would be selfish. At first, the results were nothing short of astonishing. The genetically modified individuals, called the improved, displayed extraordinary virtues. They were brave, honest, generous, and peaceful. It seemed like they had found the key to saving humanity. But soon cracks began to appear in this utopia. By eliminating certain flaws, they also removed essential parts of what made people human. The improved were generous, yes, but some didn't know when to prioritize themselves. Others, incapable of lying, became brutally honest to the point of hurting those around them. The brave often took unnecessary risks that endangered their lives. And the worst part, the non-improved, those who had not undergone genetic modification, began to look at the improved with distrust. Tensions grew rapidly. The non-improved feared losing their place in the world, while the improved started to feel superior. Arguments turned into confrontations, and confrontations turned into violence. Governments, trying to maintain control, began restricting the rights of the non-improved. They segregated them, discriminated against them, and even forced them to undergo genetic procedures to fix them. But many resisted. At that point, the gap between the two groups was unbridgeable. The pure, those who had not been genetically modified, started to resent the improved. To the pure, the improved represented a threat. They were seen as superior beings who could replace them. Meanwhile, the improved, many of whom had been designed to excel in specific virtues, began to believe that their condition made them morally superior. Governments, largely led by improved scientists and politicians, began implementing laws to consolidate power in the hands of the genetically modified. The pure were denied access to certain jobs, quality education, and even basic rights. "It's for the good of humanity," the leaders said. But the pure didn't see it that way. To them, it was the beginning of social extermination. The first outbreak took place in one of the world's major cities, when a group of pure individuals organized a peaceful march demanding equal rights. What began as a protest ended in a massacre when security forces, mostly composed of the improved, opened fire. Innocent blood filled the streets, and footage of the event spread rapidly. What started as isolated confrontations soon escalated into a full-scale war, the genetic war. The massacre united the pure under a common cause, resisting the improved. Underground groups formed worldwide, using old technology and scarce resources to organize. Although the pure lacked the genetic advantages of their enemies, they outnumbered them, and their determination to survive was unwavering. On the other hand, the improved began to use their genetic superiority not only to govern, but also to exterminate those they considered defective. Mandatory sterilization programs were enforced on the pure, further fueling hatred and rebellion. Tensions escalated rapidly until the first biological weapons were deployed. These biological weapons were released in major cities and wiped out millions within days. The whole world turned into a battlefield. Cities became uninhabitable, with streets full of corpses and air contaminated by toxins and viruses. No one was safe. As the war progressed, nations ceased to exist. Governments collapsed, supply chains broke down, and the few areas that remained intact were controlled by factions of pure or improved individuals, each fighting to survive. Ordinary people caught in the crossfire began to die in massive numbers, not just from weapons, but from hunger, disease, and the total collapse of society. Even the leaders of both sides began to question whether continuing the fight was worth it. The casualties were so high that both the pure and the improved faced extinction. Finally, after decades of conflict, both sides faced an undeniable truth. If they continued fighting, there would be no one left to claim victory. It was then that a group of surviving scientists and thinkers, both pure and improved, secretly gathered to find a solution. They realized that the attempt to fix humanity had been a mistake. But they also knew that human flaws could not simply be ignored. They concluded that the only way forward was to start anew under controlled conditions. They designed a plan to create isolated communities where human virtues could be cultivated without direct genetic intervention. This plan was the precursor to the faction system, and thus, the Bureau of Genetic Welfare was born. The Bureau of Genetic Welfare was created by the survivors of the genetic war to oversee an ambitious and radical plan to restore humanity's genetic purity. This governmental body had the authority to design and control experiments aimed at correcting the mistakes of the past. The Bureau established isolated communities, such as Chicago, where the faction system was implemented. These communities served as social experiments aimed at observing how humans could overcome their flaws without resorting to direct genetic manipulation. The faction system in Chicago and other similar cities was designed as a strategy to rebuild human virtues and eventually restore damaged genes. Each faction represented a key virtue: abnegation, altruism to counter selfishness, dauntless, bravery to overcome cowardice, erudite, intelligence to avoid ignorance, amity, peace to combat aggression, candor, honesty to eliminate lies. This initial classification was likely conducted through an assessment of the inhabitants' behavior, values, and psychological traits. The Bureau hoped that, over generations, natural selection and social interactions within the factions would lead to genetic regeneration. Divergence, individuals who exhibited traits from multiple factions, were considered a sign of success in this process, as their DNA showed signs of returning to its pure state. Over the generations, children born into the faction system inherited their parents' faction allegiance. However, upon reaching adolescence, all young people had to participate in a choosing ceremony, a rite that allowed them to freely select which faction they wanted to belong to. This process included an aptitude test, designed to identify which faction best matched their skills and values. The aptitude test involved simulations that placed the young participants in scenarios where their decisions reflected a particular virtue. For example, making sacrifices for others, abnegation; facing their fears, dauntless; seeking knowledge, erudite; telling the truth at all costs, candor; maintaining harmony in a difficult situation, amity. While the test suggested an ideal faction, the final choice was personal. This allowed some flexibility within the system, but also created social tensions, especially when someone left their family's faction, becoming a transfer. Divergents, those who exhibited an affinity for more than one faction, were an unintended consequence of the experiment. Their existence indicated that the human genome was beginning to heal, but they also represented a threat to the faction system because they could not be easily controlled. For this reason, the system's leaders, influenced by Bureau policies, considered them dangerous and often tried to eliminate them. Although the Bureau designed the experiment, they did not directly interact with the inhabitants of Chicago. Instead, they observed and collected data from a distance, allowing the factions to self-manage. However, the Bureau stepped in whenever they believed the experiment was at risk. The faction system, though designed to promote virtue, ultimately became a tool of oppression. The factions not only divided people, but also fostered rivalries and discrimination, perpetuating the very problems the Bureau had sought to solve. Ultimately, the Bureau's solution failed, not due to its scientific design, but because it overlooked the complexity of human nature and the fundamental need for freedom and diversity in a healthy society. Let me know in the comments what other topics you'd like to see covered on the channel, and remember, if you enjoy this type of video, the best way to support me is by leaving a like, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell. See you in the next video.